Hello, I'm Andrew Kamei-Deitch, and we're continuing our look at pre-modern Japan. Today we're going to be talking about warriors. Now, a few key points to talk about are here as background. First of all, the late 12th century was a time of drastic upheaval at the political center that would bring new forces into play and change the direction of Japanese history, namely these warriors. Now, warriors in the general sense had existed since ancient times, but our contemporary view of them is highly distorted. So, we know of course about popular images of samurai and bushido and this sort of thing, but what were Japanese warriors really like? Let's take a look. First of all, I want to point out some general characteristics. Japanese warriors were not professional career soldiers or a social class. So we're not talking here about a professional, well-trained, consistently organized army or anything like that. Generally speaking, they were farmers or fishermen that would serve as warriors when needed. They were mainly based in the provinces, and they performed tasks like repelling pirates, suppressing rebellions, and keeping order. They tended to value individual strength and reputation over the group. So the image we have in contemporary Japanese society where we say everything is group-orientated and group-organized doesn't really apply when we're talking about these early warriors, but tended to put a great emphasis on their individual performance rather than their performance as a group. Why? Because they weren't paid a regular salary. Their reward, in terms of land and payment for valiant service, was something that would depend upon their actual ability in combat. So they would actually prove that they had done very well performing their duties, and therefore they deserved to be rewarded for them. So therefore, this kind of individual identity, the sense of establishing yourself as distinct from the group because of your own valiant performance, was more important. Now, another thing we tend to get incorrect about these warriors is the notion of loyalty. So we tend to have this assumption that samurai have an absolute sense of loyalty and they are always loyal to their master, but the real picture is a little bit more complicated. They tended to understand loyalty as a contract rather than as an absolute concept. So you established a relationship with a lord and agreed to serve them in exchange for recognition and reward. And if either side refused to keep their side of the deal, then that would be null and void. So loyalty was not something that was considered to be an eternal absolute. Now, not only general characteristics, I want to talk a little bit about their fighting skills as well. Because they tended to come from local areas and they weren't used to fighting as a group, their gear and fighting styles would vary by locale. Also, the vital weapon in their arsenal was the bow, not the sword. Swords tended to be used as backup weapons. It was all about bow. Now, why was bow skill considered to be so important? This was the type of warfare they engaged in. They didn't tend to have long, drawn-out battles. They tended to have short skirmishes, often on horseback, and therefore mounted archery was the elite skill of the time. So the imagery we have about samurai being obsessed with swords and all of this focus on sword play and sword imagery and romanticization of blades and so forth, this is something that developed much later in Japanese history. Early on, it's actually all about archery. Now, military success was often more important than honor. Again, this much reputed bushido is actually an early modern concept. It did not yet exist. When we think about early warriors in Japan, one of the people who often occurs to us is Taira no Masakado. He was a leading warrior in East Japan who infamously led an insurrection against the court. Now, he was defeated, but he was still revered both as a proud warrior and a fearsome spirit, and continues to be so today. In fact, the legend says that his head actually flew away after he was decapitated, and that it landed in part of what's now Tokyo, whereupon it was enshrined. And even today, you can go and visit the location where his head has been preserved. So this is still a place that receives a lot of attention, and Taira no Masakado is still widely regarded in Japanese society as being a very sort of strong-willed, proud warrior spirit, even though he was someone who stood against the government. Now, warriors became more important in the late 12th century because of the breakdown in the system that I alluded to 2 sessions back. So in the late Heian period, there's increasingly problems in the court where courtiers are trying to settle these various political or economic disputes, and increasingly they tended to call upon warriors to try to solve their problems. So if you have a fight between 2 courtier families, courtier family A would bring in warriors to fight for them, and courtier family B would bring in warriors to fight for them. There'd be a big brawl, and then this would determine which family would walk away with the prize. As time went by and warriors became more and more involved in such disputes, they also began to gain more influence in politics. So let's take a look at warriors and politics at the end of the Heian period. Key event here to look at is the Hogen War. This was a succession dispute between Go Shirakawa Tenno and his brother Sutoku In, so the retired sovereign. The court was divided over this issue, and the leading warriors of the 2 major families, the Taira and the Minamoto, were recruited to fight for both sides. Now, you see here at the bottom that we have the Taira family and the Minamoto family. The Taira are also known as the Heike, and the Minamoto are also known as the Genji. This has no relation to the Genji Monogatari that we talked about last time. So here are how the 2 big factions in the Hogen War lined up. So we have Go Shirakawa Tenno over here and Sutoku In on this side, and you can see that each of them also had someone from the regental families involved in the conflict, and they also had many leading warriors. You'll notice that each side has both Taira and Minamoto figures on it. So there wasn't any sense that warrior families had to behave as one cohesive unit. Certainly in a struggle, you would have people show up on both sides. In fact, this was actually sometimes more common, because if there was a fight within a family where 2 brothers, for example, were struggling over who was going to be in charge, then any time a political dispute developed, it was a perfect opportunity to split on the issue, because if you won, then you could gain sort of, something over your brother who had been on the losing side. So it wasn't uncommon to see families split like this. Well, the dispute itself was over relatively quickly. Go Shirakawa's side won in just a few days, whereupon he became a retired sovereign and stayed in power until his death in 1192. And we'll be talking quite a bit more about Go Shirakawa as time goes on. Well, the Minamoto family, led by Minamoto no Yoshitomo, and the Taira family, led by Taira no Kiyomori, became major political forces in the capital as a result of the outcome of this dispute. And military power became recognized as essential to resolve even internal court conflicts. So this is clearly symbolic of how warriors had come to the forefront of Japanese political society. As time went by, the rivalry between the Minamoto and the Taira families intensified. So we have Yoshitomo here on the left and Kiyomori on the right. Now, eventually, a war between the families broke out. This was the Heiji War in 1160, and it ended with Yoshitomo dead and Kiyomori in a much more powerful position. Kiyomori took advantage of his new position to try and establish his own type of polity. It was a type of military government led by the Taira family, and it incorporated a power-sharing relationship between the court and the Taira family. Kiyomori gained land and the status of the regental families, and this represented a major challenge to the old order. So essentially, he's carving off a piece of power and authority from the court and saying, I'm going to be handling this, my family is going to be responsible for these matters, and the court can handle the rest of it. Now, Go Shirakawa did not play along with this. He worked to undermine Kiyomori at every opportunity, and there were several anti-Taira plots that broke out. Kiyomori eventually responded with an outright coup in 1179. He put Go Shirakawa under house arrest, put the Taira family in complete control, and put his own little grandson, Antoku, on the throne. This then set up events for the Genpei War from 1180 to 1185. Now, there has been some debate in Japanese historiography over whether we should continue to talk about this as a Genpei War, the war between, you can see, Genpei, right, the Minamoto and the Taira, considering that there were, first of all, many other forces involved in this conflict, and second, that the conflict itself was quite drawn out and complex, and so it seems a little bit simplistic to narrow it down to just being a struggle between the two families. However, it is a helpful narrative to gauge the general trend, and so that's what we're going to be following here. Well, here we go. Go Shirakawa's son, Prince Mochihito, called upon Yoshitomo's son, Yoritomo, and the other Minamoto warriors to fight the Taira. So earlier, Kiyomori had spared Yoshitomo's sons, even though he had been pressured by others to kill them. And so Yoritomo and some of the other Minamoto warriors who had survived rallied together to fight against the Taira. Now, Mochihito himself was captured and killed quite early on, but the Minamoto forces were able to regroup and they continued to fight. Even after Kiyomori himself passed on in 1181, the conflict continued. Eventually, the Minamoto gained the upper hand, they regained Kyoto, and pushed the Taira back west. The final battle in the conflict occurred in March 1185 at a place called Dan-no-ura, and it was in fact a naval conflict. Now, during this conflict, the Taira had Antoku Tenno with them and the royal regalia, but they were betrayed by a defecting general. So even though initially they also had a tactical advantage in the battle, by the end they lost. Now, most of the Taira leaders were killed or committed suicide, and Antoku Tenno himself drowned. It was a decisive Minamoto victory. Infamously, they also lost one of the three royal regalia, the sword, in the water, and it was never recovered. So this briefly led to a series of great consternation and concern at the court over what was to be done since they had lost this item. The saga of the war became quite widely known through the medieval tale Heike Monogatari. Just like the Genji Monogatari we talked about last time, the Heike has become an extremely famous work and has continued to echo down through to the present. So there are many things like comics and animation based on the Heike even today, and the major heroes and villains of the tale are, of course, quite well known to people. So this is just a map indicating some of the major battles during the Genpei War, and you can see that I have circled Dan-no-ura here in the far left. And here are some of the key Minamoto figures. Minamoto no Yoritomo in the middle, so I mentioned. Yoshitsune was his brother, and Yoshitsune is someone who was regarded as a tactical genius. Eventually, he emerged as a rival to Yoritomo, who then felt forced to defeat him. But there continues to be, in contemporary Japanese society, a great amount of regard for Yoshitsune as a very strong-willed and able military leader. And finally, over here on the right, we have Hojo no Masako. Hojo no Masako was Yoritomo's wife and someone who was also extremely influential in the politics of the day. Well, the outcome of the war, the removal of the Taira rivals cleared the way for the establishment of Minamoto hegemony. Over the next several years, Yoritomo was able to slowly replace Kiyomori's system with his own, eventually creating a new warrior government. So he continued this division of power that Kiyomori had set up, but instead of the Taira family, it was the Minamoto family and people around them who were to take over this responsibility. So this led to the creation of the Kamakura Bakufu, a new type of warrior government. So in conclusion, we can say that the late 12th century saw a series of crises that destabilized the classical order, and this opened the way for increasing dominance of politics by warriors. Although the Taira were the first successful warrior family, the polity that they founded did not long endure. It was in fact the Minamoto who forged the first lasting military government in Japanese history, and we're going to be talking more about that next time. Thank you very much.